Sports Talk with Girl Dads back on the podcast of the Sports Buffet. I'm Bob Alvis, joined by Cam Shepard. The beauty of this is you didn't even know this was happening until I put it out on Twitter.
No, you gave me about an hour notice, which is great. Happy to be here with you.
But we have something very big to talk about that I think you have a great insight to, and I have an opinion to as well. By the way, my opinions are reflective of me. Cam's opinions are not affiliated with Brookville High School or anything
Of course,
of that ilk. But Danny Hurley, the U Conn coach, as of this podcast, as of our recording, has not made a decision yet to whether he stays at U Conn or goes to the Lakers. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's obviously been kind of the talk of the basketball world the last few days. I think you have to look at it from this perspective. I think you have to think, okay, every coach in any profession, any sport, whatever you're doing, if you can get to the highest level, I think that would be the goal for anybody. I think coaching for the Los Angeles Lakers, most people would say, is the mecca for coaching in basketball. You're talking about one of maybe two or three jobs that would be considered the greatest coaching jobs you could achieve. So put aside money, put aside things like that. As a competitor and as somebody who's worked your whole life as a coach, to be able to achieve that, it's something very few people could ever say they achieved. So I think that makes this more difficult. He's not going to the Charlotte Hornets. He's not going to, the Washington Wizards. He's going to potentially the Los Angeles Lakers. So I think that makes this difficult. But then you're talking about life-changing money, right? I think I saw something on social media today that mentioned something in the realm of 8 years, $100 million potentially. I mean, that's the type of money where if Dan Hurley happens to get fired in 3 years, depending on, the verbiage in the contract, he may never have to work again. He may never have to coach. His family is set for generations. So I think those are things you have to consider. In my personal opinion, I've watched Dan Hurley, to be honest, studied a lot of things he does, especially on the offensive end. I think he's a genius when it comes to, offensive sets and getting certain guys looks and, having a million different options out of, a 30-second set. I've watched him and tried to emulate some things. I see him as a college coach myself. I think he coaches with a level of passion and a level of intensity that is more meant for the college game. I think, the college game still, even with NIL and things like that, there's a place for molding young men and molding young women and, molding athletes that are growing into young men and women. And I think his style fits that more than going to the NBA where it's completely 100% of business. You don't have to, and most of the time are not expected to coach in that fashion. There might be one or two coaches in the NBA that you would think their coaching style resembles Dan Hurley. Well, off the top of my head, I could think of Thibodeau and maybe a little bit Popovich, but other than that, you see, guys that are more kind of back in the shadows as coaches instead of on the front lines being vocal, coaching with intensity like Dan Hurley does. And I would worry from that standpoint, just my personal opinion, does he have to change who he is to be the Los Angeles Lakers head coach to fit that role? And is he comfortable in that? That would be the only red flag I would see for him taking that job.
Yeah, I think the big difference with Pop has earned the respect of people along the times. I don't know that NBA guys are going to respect Dan Hurley until Dan Hurley's had success in the league to a degree that Dan Hurley probably deserves the respect. I remember the last big college coach that was rumored to go to the Lakers at one point was Coach K.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when Kobe was still playing. And I think with Coach K's garnering that respect because A, he was an older gentleman at the time, B, he had been doing it on the college level for probably close to 20 years at a high level when Duke really got good. So Dan Hurley, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to knock Dan Hurley at all, but Dan Hurley has his success. The resume is much smaller than a Mike Krzyzewski. If Dan Hurley takes the job, which by the way I don't think he's going to take it, because the thing to me is, and this is going to be East Coast bias right here, the job of jobs in the NBA to me would be the Celtics, not the Lakers. How many coaches that you can think of have been at the top of their game and say, hey, I really want to go coach the Lakers? I mean, Frank Vogel, people didn't really know him. Mike Brown coached the Lakers for a little bit, but I don't remember if Mike Brown wanted to go coach the Lakers if he was leaving hot or if they got him on the way down. Darvin Ham, again, not trying to knock any of these guys, but Darvin Ham, what was his resume before going to the Lakers? You've had a lot of guys that have been good assistants. They've been known in the league. So anyway, but if Dan Hurley says no, then does your attention turn back to J.J. Redick?
It certainly sounds that way. It sounds like, even until probably a week ago, I mean, it didn't sound like, at least from a public standpoint, that Dan Hurley was much of an option. Last few days, he's really come into the forefront. But listening to the reports, it sounds like Dan Hurley may have been the guy they wanted all along. He's just been taking his time with the process. But one would think, based on the things you've heard, that JJ's the next option. And then that becomes very interesting because now you're talking about probably the guy in Dan Hurley that anybody would pick as their first choice right now as a head coach for an opening. He's at the top of his game as far as the coaching world goes in college basketball, with back-to-back national championships. And then you look at a guy like J.J. Redick, who has no formal coaching experience. Shout out to Roanoke, Virginia, Cave Spring graduate, myself being a William Byrd graduate from the Roanoke area. Do I think J.J. Redick is an exceptional basketball mind? Absolutely. I think you listen to him for 5 minutes, during his podcast, or listen to him when he's commentating for the NBA Finals or anything, you can tell he obviously knows the game. If you ever watched him play, he was a very cerebral player. He learned how to get the most out of his ability. As far as shooting, he's probably one of the most exceptional shooters the NBA ever saw. But as far as comparisons to the other guys, wasn't an exceptional athlete, right? At 6'4", is a good sized guard, but not 6'7", 6'8" guards that we see now in the NBA. But he stretched that out to a really impressive, 15, 16-year career or whatever he played. Made a lot of money, played on some high-level teams. And, I think that has struck a chord with LeBron, myself. And I think LeBron has started to, really, really push for JJ. And it seems, at least, again, from a public standpoint, that's where the push for JJ to become the next coach has come from. It seems like it started with LeBron. Now, obviously, we know most places LeBron has gone, he's had a hand in who gets hired as the coach. Is JJ the best option? That remains to be seen. But, who's to say that bringing in a fresh face, fresh ideas isn't the right thing? So many times we see in the NBA, they just recycle coaches. Guys get fired and they go right into an associate head coaching role for a couple years, and they're right back into a head coaching job instead of some new faces coming in. We've seen it fail with Steve Nash in Brooklyn, but who's to say this isn't the right option and that this could be the right fit? The Lakers are an interesting team because you have an aging LeBron, you have an AD who, putting last year aside, which was one of the healthiest years he's had in a long time, he's very injury prone. And then besides that, most people would say you have a team of role players. Now they've got some good pieces, some good role players, but are they championship ready? My humble opinion, I would say no. They've got to add some pieces. And so you're bringing in somebody who's never coached at that level before with an aging superstar, maybe, the guy that a lot of people say is the greatest player of all time, probably at the least, Jordan 1A, LeBron 1B. that's a tough situation to walk into, having never had to lead an organization, and now you've got to lead the most watched organization in basketball. I've told you, Bob, before. I think the Lakers' job is like coaching the Dallas Cowboys. It's like coaching the New York Yankees. You are in the public eye 24/7, and if you're LeBron's coach, it's heightened even
Sure.
more. So I think that's tough. Do I think JJ has great coach written all over him? Absolutely. I think just from a basketball mind, he certainly does. But is he the answer? I think that remains to be seen.
Well, I think one thing is JJ can plug and play because when JJ was a player in the NBA, JJ was not the superstar.
Sure.
So maybe JJ was, I hate to call him a role player, but JJ had to, plug and play a little bit to where that's what you're going to do after LeBron and AD. Rumored about JJ's staff was, JJ, I know Rondo was on it. I think Sam Cassell was on the rumors,
Right.
of course. And the guy from, I think it's from Charlotte, but I can't remember who it was. It was somebody who's been in the league for a while. Okay, so let's pretend. Well, actually, before we pretend, with all due respect, you have an ego. It's probably not as big as JJ Redick's ego, but you have an ego. If you caught drift that somebody else was a number one choice for a job, and you were number two, number one turns them down, are you okay with taking that job even though you knew you weren't the first choice?
So that would depend, for me personally, that would depend on what kind of job we're talking about. If we're talking about, if we put me directly in JJ's position right now, that would not bother me a bit.
Okay.
Because, again, we're talking about me getting an opportunity to be the head coach of probably, if not the number one most storied franchise in the NBA, definitely one of the two most storied franchises in the NBA, with no formal coaching experience, never had to be an assistant coach, never had to really earn my stripes, nothing. I could care less if I was choice 1, 2, or 3. I'm getting that opportunity, and if coaching's what I want my future to be, you're talking about jump-starting it in the best way possible. So me, no, I wouldn't be hurt by being the second choice. I'm also looking at who would quote-unquote be the first choice in Dan Hurley.
Right.
Pretty impressive first choice, so I'm not going to be – my feelings aren't going to be hurt by that.
I would have to do a little bit more research on this topic, and it's a little bit older than you because you weren't even born, but I know you're a historian. This seems very much, and I think I've read a comparison, when Pat Riley took the Lakers job back in, I want to say it was 1980, he was succeeding Paul Westhead, who was a pretty highly touted NBA coach at the time, not like, Red Auerbach or anything, but I mean, it worked out for Pat Riley.
Right.
Pat Riley went on to do great things.
Right.
Could it work out for JJ? Anyway, your U Conn. Dan Hurley leaves. Who are you calling? Or what are you doing, I should say, because maybe you don't even need to make a call, because I've heard rumors. Do you bump up one of the two assistants? With all due respect, it hasn't really worked well for Villanova, which they tried to do when Jay Wright left. They bumped up Kyle Neptune, and I don't think Villanova's made the tournament under Neptune.
So the landscape of college athletics has changed so much. For me, I'm going to find, A, the best recruiter that I can get, and B, whoever can garner the most NIL support possible. Whoever that candidate is, that's who I'm going to get. Whether that's offering a guy who may not seem super happy in his NBA current job, like a Billy Donovan. Not saying he's not happy with the Bulls, but, could he be an option? Sure. There are guys that are unemployed right now that I think, you have a famous line. You always say they're going to have to tell me no before I accept no. I'm probably going to call Jay Wright just to see what he thinks.
Right.
Guys like that who are proven winners who, the landscape of college basketball has changed where you have to have the NIL money. You have to re-recruit your kids every year. But who are we seeing have the most success? It is these guys who also know how to coach. We're seeing the guys still at the top in the Bill Selfs and people like that. They're adapting to the new ways with the NIL, but those guys can still coach.
Sure.
They're still the, upper echelon coaches that they've always been. And if you can go get one of those guys, Billy Donovan obviously was a back-to-back national champion at Florida. If you can go find one of those guys or find, an NBA assistant who, has been used to the business side of things,
Right.
and that's kind of the way college basketball is moving, that would be the direction I would move first.
Well, you can't turn this into you're getting no'd by 5 or 6 people before
Right.
you. I mean, you've
Right.
got to, U Conn, I don't think is necessarily the school that's going to throw Scrooge McDuck money at you, to where it's going to be 10 million a year type of thing.
Yeah, I don't
whatnot.
think the next candidate's necessarily going to get what they're offering Dan Hurley to stay.
But he's got to get enough money to make it. You got to
Right.
grab somebody's attention
Right.
with the money. Speaking of coaches, as we wrapped up another high school season of spring sports, as state championships were today, I asked a question on my Twitter that I thought was a good question, but apparently it wasn't, because a lot of names came up. Alums that have coached their alma mater to a state championship, Gary Harris and Scott Zering, both had the chance at JF today. Unfortunately for them, they were both denied. Just on your recollection of knowing some of the names, I don't want to say who do you think is the best, but who would you most like to have played for that's coached their alma mater to a state? Do we need to go over some names?
Yeah, throw out some names and I'll
Let's
give you my
see.
thoughts.
Man, I knew you were going to do that to me. It's funny because it's never happened at JF. Brookville had it happen with Jeff Woody and Jim White. Amherst has had it happen with Bill Dawson. Appomattox has had it happen, I think, a few times on the softball. Katie Bigham, who was a very good pitcher in high school and a Liberty Hall of Famer, did it at Rustburg. So it's weird that it's happened more often. And it's funny because in Southwest Virginia, like far Southwest Virginia, like the gate cities of the world and whatnot, it seems like a lot of those people come back to coach at where they went to school. And I don't say it's because nobody wants to live in Southwest Virginia, but it's just you have more familiarity, it seems like,
Right.
there. So how hard do you think it would be if you went back to Byrd to coach your alma mater to a state title?
I think coaching anywhere, anyone to a state championship is tough.
That's
You
why
know,
I thought the question was good, because I didn't think it would have happened that much, because now we have 6 state champions in Virginia,
Yeah.
but how many schools do we have?
Right.
A lot more
it's
than
a
6.
ton. Right. I think it obviously means more when it's your alma mater. Being the boys basketball coach at Brookville, I have 2 Brookville alums on my coaching staff, and you can tell that what we do means a lot to them because it's home to them.
Right.
So if hypothetically you use William Byrd where I went, like it would mean a ton going back and doing something like that at your alma mater, because that's where you played, that's where you were, that's where you became someone that loved that sport. There would be a lot of people you feel like you're paying back almost by winning a state championship at your alma mater. But thinking about some of the people you named,
Somebody we talked about too, Renee at Lord Bottai.
yes,
I forgot about Renee.
yes. I'm obviously some football changes happening at Brookville High School. Hearing a lot about Jeff Woody and now getting to meet Jeff Woody in person and semi-interact with the football coaches. We have our basketball kids live with them in the in the spring, and they seem like guys I would want to play for. Coach Woody seems to have a ton of energy and has a way that he builds relationships with the players, and he seems like a guy you would want to play with or play for. And then Jim White, obviously I've gotten to know Jim White quite a bit, coaching at Brookville, and one of my assistant coaches played for Coach White and speaks highly of him, and the way he speaks about Coach White, he seems like a guy that wanted the gritty side of the players to be evident all the time. Like he wanted tough guys, he wanted guys that wanted to win more than anything else. And I think that's how I coach. I think that's something I push. And when I played, those were the coaches I wanted to play for. I wanted people that pushed winning more than anything. It doesn't really matter how we get it done. Let's just get it done. Those would be the type of people that I enjoy, that I would have wanted to play for. And I'm trying to think.
Mike Cardellaro did it at Perry McClure.
Yeah,
I forgot about
I'm
him.
trying to think some others. Is Kevin Garst a Salem graduate? because Kevin Garst has a state championship for basketball as a coach at Salem.
I think so.
I know Kevin Garst is a Hampton-Sydney alum, but I'm trying to think if he's a Salem graduate, he would be one. Great guy, great coach, good friend of mine. Would love to play for him if I was to go back and could play. He would be a guy I would love to play for.
Because it's funny. I know Mark Hanks is not a Liberty graduate, but Mark Hanks won, I want to say at least 2 at Liberty Bedford, which was not an easy thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more names that you can name that haven't coached. But like I said, when I threw this question out, I got names left and right. Like I said, it happens more at smaller schools, or I would not say smaller schools as much as I would say smaller communities.
Right.
With all due respect, Brookville. It's not a smaller community because it's in Lynchburg.
Sure.
Rustburg has had a few. Kristen Hardy on the volleyball side. I mentioned Katie on the softball side. So it's happened, but it hasn't happened often, in my opinion. But again, you throw a question out to Twitter and you will get humbled.
You're
very quickly.
You're gonna garner some attention and get some answers pretty quick on Twitter, or X as we should call it nowadays.
Yes.
Yeah.
Any topics you have off the top of your head?
Well, Bob, we talked earlier off air, but I want to get your opinion on Caitlin Clark and the uproar that has come from her entering the WNBA and what's the attention that's garnered and what's come with that. I kind of would like to know what your thoughts are on that.
It was reported today she will not be on the U.S. Olympic team.
Correct. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Which I think Caitlin Clark probably did a whole lot for women's basketball last year at Iowa and in WNBA. Talk to me in 2 years. Are we still talking about women's basketball to the level? I know even Virginia Tech got a lot of attention with Kitley and Georgia going. Now Kenny Brooks goes to Kentucky. Does he have that without the attention that women's basketball garnered? I don't know. Maybe he does. I think it helps the sport, but again, it's come talk to me in a year or two.
Yeah. I think it's tough. I think obviously there has been a huge uptick in viewership with WNBA this year. They've seen record numbers of crowds. I think the amount of people that are watching their nationally televised games has increased. Things like that. I think it's tough to say it's just because of one person. I think it's very obvious that she has a lot to do with it. I think if you say she doesn't, then you're lying to yourself. Obviously there was a change from last year to this year, and we're talking about someone who, absolutely changed the landscape of women's college basketball and is now in the WNBA, and we're starting to see it change there. But we're also talking about a league that's had some really special players for a long time. The Diana Taurasi's, Sue Birds, people like that have been in the league for a long time. But I think the type of generational player that Caitlin Clark is, the way she shoots it from so far away, how she almost is Steph Curry-esque in the way she plays. I think with that being on display at Iowa, in their national championship run, and now her being in the WNBA was an easy transition, right? There's not much of a break between women's college basketball and the start of WNBA. So that attention kind of just flowed right into the WNBA season. And I think no matter what the reason is, it's great that attention is now on women's basketball. I think it's putting on display something that probably should have been on display a long time ago, if we're being honest. And to my personal opinion, who really cares what has caused it? It's just a great thing that, the proper light is being shined on it now.
Is Caitlin Clark Michael Jordan?
You're talking to somebody who thinks Michael Jordan is the greatest player ever, so I don't know that it's fair to.
But here's the thing,
to give her that crown just yet.
Would we know Steph Curry if it weren't for Michael Jordan? Because here's my point: you had Magic and Bird, who with one without the other probably does not make the NBA. Because the NBA, I don't want to say it was dead, but it was not as healthy. You had Magic and Bird come along, who came off a NCAA national championship against each other. Then you had Michael come along. So it's not like Michael had to take it from a speck of dirt.
Sure.
Then after Michael, you had Kobe, but it took Kobe a while. I mean,
It
Michael
did.
still had to do.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you probably had Shaq, honestly.
Yeah.
Then you had Kobe. Then you had LeBron.
Yeah, I think if we just go by your question, yeah, I think so, because I think Steph Curry, he did something.
What was my question? Is Caitlin Clark Michael Jordan?
And then you said
Oh.
if there's no Michael Jordan, do we know of Steph Curry? You worded it something like that. My answer would be yes, because Steph Curry did something from the very start of his career that we really had never seen. Like, did we have, deep threat shooters? Of course we did. Did we have guys that could catch it and shoot it from range? Ray Allen, Kyle Korver, guys like that. Of course we did. But did we have guys that were doing it the way Steph Curry did, only being, 6'2", 6'3", not a big guy in stature, running off of 5-6 screens, having to move the entire possession, could do it off the dribble, could break you down off the dribble and separate and get a shot off. I think he just did it in such a special way, and not only did it, but has done it his whole career at such a high level, at such a degree of difficulty. I mean, I think Steph Curry's name, in my opinion, has got to be up there with the people that changed the way the game is played. He is a guy that, Jordan had people wanting to try and jump through the air and dunk.
Right.
Steph Curry has young players trying to shoot from 5-6 feet off the line. And there are other guys.
Like, good or bad, though. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's probably for another discussion.
It could be viewed in both ways,
right.
but it the way I see it, it's given some players a chance to be successful. That in a game where athleticism and height and skill level are so important, it's given maybe smaller players a chance to be successful.
And for the record, I'm not asking who's better out of Michael Jordan and Steph Curry, because that's just a
we know the
discussion
that
everybody is going to.
Yeah.
If you don't have the right answer to that, please click this podcast off. I don't want you to
know the answer.
For Cam, this is Bob. Happy Father's Day if we don't get to talk to you again. Happy Father's Day to you.
Same to you. Same to you.
And we look forward to getting more girl dads on to really maybe we'll actually talk about parenting one day. But until then, have a great night.